Within 36 months, 12% of global maritime trade will permanently bypass the Suez Canal. Here are the 5 mechanisms that will permanently redirect global trade. The corridor is funded, construction is underway, and Egypt's $10 billion revenue stream just became optional. Picture a boardroom in Riyadh, November 2023. On one side of the table sit Israeli infrastructure ministers reviewing rail corridor blueprints. On the other side, Saudi sovereign wealth fund analysts model cash flows from a $20 billion bet. Between them lies a map showing a 350-kilometer line from the Red Sea to Mediterranean ports, 8 days faster than the Suez Canal, with pipeline capacity for 1.2 million barrels daily. The Egyptians aren't in the room. They're in another building across town, negotiating their 4th IMF bailout in 7 years. I'm trying to explain how they'll service $165 billion in debt when their primary revenue asset just acquired a competitor. The question isn't if the traffic diverts, it's whether Egypt notices the volume bleeding before the debt payments come due. This is lever 1, the legacy monopoly. Here's why this matters to you. Every time a container ship delays in Suez congestion, your electronics cost 4 to 8% more and arrive 3 weeks late. The Suez Canal moves 12% of global maritime trade, 22,000 ships annually carrying $1 trillion in goods, through a 193-kilometer waterway that one country controls. Egypt charges $700,000 or more per ultra-large container vessel transit, generating $10 billion yearly because there is no alternative. That's not pricing power, that's a forced transaction. And Britain controlled the Suez Canal from 1882 to 1956, extracting £30 million or more annually, while Egypt received 7% of toll revenue. Egypt didn't realize until Nasser's 1956 nationalization that the partnership contract gave Britain veto power over toll rates, traffic prioritization, and military transit, turning sovereignty into a rental agreement. Here's the boardroom reality. Egypt operates the Suez Canal the way a landlord operates a building with one entrance. You want in? You pay the toll. You want faster service? Still pay the toll. A ship runs aground and blocks traffic for 6 days, like the Ever Given in 2021. The world loses $400 million per week in delayed cargo, and Egypt still collects fees from the 400 or more ships backed up waiting. No refunds, no alternatives, pure extraction. The canal functions as what we'd call in corporate finance a captive cash flow asset. The customer has zero negotiating leverage. Ships traveling from Asia to Europe face 2 routes: Suez at 21 days, or around Africa's Cape of Good Hope at 34 days plus 3,000 extra nautical miles. The math is brutal. 13 extra days of fuel, crew wages, and opportunity cost equals $1 to $2 million per voyage. So Egypt can charge up to that difference, and shippers will still pay. It's not a competitive market. It's a toll booth on the only bridge across the river. The mechanism gets more extractive. Egypt collects revenue regardless of service quality. Canal depth limits, 24 meters maximum, restrict the largest tankers. One-way convoy system means ships wait 12 to 18 hours for transit windows. During peak season, 21-day delays are routine. Yet traffic keeps coming because the alternative is worse. Here's what this means for you. When Suez delays spike, shipping lines pass costs downstream. That iPhone you ordered? Delayed shipments mean lower inventory, which means higher prices or out-of-stock notices. Container shipping rates from Asia to Europe surge 40 to 60% during Suez congestion. You're not paying for the canal directly. You're paying the premium baked into everything from furniture to car parts to coffee, because one choke point controls global logistics. The monopoly creates secondary leverage. Insurance premiums spike during regional instability. Houthi Red Sea attacks in 2023 and 2024 added $50,000 or more per voyage in war risk coverage, but ships still transit Suez because no alternative exists at scale. Egypt doesn't even need to improve service. Geography is the moat. You might be thinking, Egypt wouldn't risk killing the golden goose. They need that revenue too badly to overcharge or let service deteriorate. Here's the problem with that assumption. Egypt's external debt is $165 billion with $42 billion in annual debt service. They need every dollar now, which means maximizing short-term revenue extraction over long-term service quality. When you're 18 months from a sovereign default, you don't invest in customer satisfaction. You squeeze the captive revenue source until something breaks. And that's just lever one, the legacy monopoly. The smoke-filled room is where we discover what happens when two countries with $2 trillion in combined sovereign wealth decide that monopoly is negotiable. This is lever two, the normalization covenant. Here's why this matters to you. When major economies restructure trade routes, your gas prices shift 15 to 20% based on energy delivery speed. The Abraham Accords in 2020 weren't just diplomatic theater. They were the credit facility that unlocked $20 billion or more in joint infrastructure investment between Israel and Saudi Arabia. What the press releases called normalization, the boardroom calls counterparty diversification with covenant structure. Israel gets Saudi capital and Arab League integration. Saudi Arabia gets Red Sea Mediterranean logistics optionality and security guarantees from U.S. military presence. The asset being restructured, Egypt's Suez revenue stream. In 1869, France and Britain engineered the original Suez Canal financing, which presented as Egyptian infrastructure development, while structuring debt covenants that transferred canal control to European creditors by 1875. The partnership language masked a forced asset sale within 6 years of opening. Picture the actual room where this was structured. Washington, D.C., 2020, with the UAE and Bahrain signing first, testing market reception. Behind the diplomatic language, historic peace agreement, the commercial terms were being priced. Israel offered Red Sea port access at Eilat, Mediterranean terminal capacity at Haifa and Ashdod, and existing oil pipeline infrastructure from the 1968 Eilat-Ashkelon line. Saudi Arabia and the UAE offered $3 billion or more in immediate bilateral trade, energy, tech, defense contracts, and sovereign wealth fund capital for infrastructure scaling. The U.S. offered F-35s to the UAE, expanded military aid to Israel, and naval presence guaranteeing Red Sea corridor security. The normalization covenant works like a syndicated credit facility, arranged financing with conditions. Israel-Saudi cooperation was previously blocked by lack of diplomatic relations. No formal contracts, no bilateral investment, no joint infrastructure. Abraham Accords removed that blocker, suddenly making a $20 billion rail pipeline project legally executable. But here's the covenant structure. Normalization is conditional. If Saudi Arabia reversed recognition, the infrastructure financing collapses. If Israel didn't deliver port access and security cooperation, Saudi capital disappears. It's a mutual hostage structure. Both sides locked in by sunk costs and covenant breach penalties. Diplomatic isolation and stranded assets. The smoke-filled room element. This wasn't announced as Egypt's displacement strategy. Press releases emphasize regional cooperation and economic development. But pull the financial models. Every feasibility study for Israel-Saudi corridor explicitly calculated traffic diversion from Suez. The Saudi Public Investment Fund didn't commit $10 billion or more to duplicate an existing route. They modeled cannibalizing it. Egypt wasn't invited to the signing ceremony. They weren't even briefed until 6 months later. Here's what this means for you. The corridor's pipeline capacity, 1.2 million barrels daily, cuts Europe-Asia oil transit from 16 days via Suez to 8 days via Eilat Mediterranean ports. That's not marginal, it's a 50% delivery time reduction. When energy moves faster, prices stabilize. When prices stabilize, your gas costs 10 to 15 cents less per gallon. But that's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario, if Egypt retaliates by restricting Suez access or regional conflict disrupts both routes, you're looking at $200 or more per barrel oil and $6 or more per gallon gas. The normalization covenant creates a new regional alignment. UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and potentially Saudi Arabia forming an economic bloc with Israel, $1 trillion or more combined GDP with Red Sea Mediterranean infrastructure integration. This pulls Chinese Belt and Road investment toward hedging. Finance both the Israel-Saudi corridor and Egypt's Suez expansion, ensuring one succeeds regardless of geopolitical outcome. Egypt loses either way. If they compete with Chinese debt, they're deeper in the IMF hole. Now, if they don't compete, traffic diverts anyway. You might be thinking, Saudi normalization with Israel is still politically toxic. Domestic opposition could collapse the deal before construction finishes. Here's the problem with that assumption. $20 billion is already allocated. Construction contracts are signed. The rail corridor is 30% complete as of early 2025. At this scale, reversal isn't politically viable. Saudi Arabia would have to eat a $6 to $8 billion sunk cost loss and explain to sovereign wealth fund stakeholders why they burned capital. The political risk was priced in when they signed. The infrastructure creates irreversibility. That's lever 2, the normalization unlock. Now we go deeper into the actual bypass mechanism that makes Suez revenue optional. This is lever 3, the capacity bypass, the most critical mechanism in the entire displacement. Here's why this matters to you. Infrastructure sunk costs create permanent economic gravity. Once Israel and Saudi Arabia complete a $20 billion rail pipeline corridor with 50 million tons annual freight capacity, the traffic never returns to Suez, even if tolls drop to zero, because time is more valuable than money in global logistics. The corridor isn't trying to compete with Suez. It's making Suez geographically irrelevant. When the U.S. completed the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, same year as Suez opening, it didn't close maritime shipping around South America. It just made 80% of Pacific Atlantic cargo divert to the faster land route within a decade. Panama Canal traffic dropped 40% in the first 5 years after U.S. rail network integration. Yeah, Egypt is about to learn the same lesson. Here's the boardroom calculus. The planned route runs 350 kilometers from Saudi Arabia's Red Sea Neom megaproject to Israel's Mediterranean ports, Haifa and Ashdod. Current specs: double-track electrified rail for containerized freight and passengers, plus parallel pipeline for 1.2 million barrels daily of crude oil and LNG. Transit time: Red Sea to Mediterranean in 8 to 10 hours versus 12 to 16 hours through Suez. But here's where the leverage compounds. The corridor doesn't need to handle all 22,000 ships currently using Suez. It only needs to capture 12 to 15%, 2,500 to 3,300 ships, to break Egypt's fiscal model. At $700,000 average revenue per ship, losing 2,640 vessels annually means $1.8 billion gone, nearly 20% of Suez income. The bypass works through sequenced capacity deployment. Phase 1, operational 2027 to 2028. Pipeline goes live first, capturing energy flows. Oil and LNG tankers represent 30% of Suez traffic, but 45% of revenue. Larger vessels pay higher tolls. Once European refineries and Asian exporters see 8-day faster delivery, they redirect contracts. This creates the volume anchor. Phase 2, operational the 2028 to 2029. Rail freight begins container service. Now that energy flows are established, shipping lines commit slot capacity for finished goods, electronics, auto parts, the high-value cargo where time savings justify slightly higher per container costs. Here's the mechanism's elegance. The corridor doesn't need price parity with Suez. It needs time arbitrage. A container ship losing 8 days in transit burns $50,000 or more in fuel and wages, plus opportunity cost of capital tied up in floating inventory. If the corridor charges $850,000 versus Suez's $700,000, shippers still save money on total voyage economics. That $150,000 premium disappears against 8-day savings. Egypt cannot compete on time. Geography is fixed. They can only compete on price, which means slashing tolls, which collapses revenue, which triggers the debt spiral. The capacity numbers tell the story. Suez maxes out at 97 ships daily, doubled via 2015 expansion. The corridor targets 50 million tons annually, equivalent to 2,500 to 3,000 vessels. That's 12 to 15% of current Suez volume. But here's the compounding effect. As traffic diverts, Suez congestion eases, which reduces delay costs, task which removes the urgency for more ships to divert, until the next regional crisis, Houthi attacks, political instability, reminds everyone that single choke point dependency is unacceptable risk. Then another wave diverts. Suez enters a death spiral. Lower volume leads to higher per ship costs to cover fixed expenses, which leads to more diversion, which leads to even lower volume. Here's what this means for you. If you're holding shipping stocks, Maersk, MSC, CMA, CGM, they win either way. Lower transit times mean more voyages per year per vessel, increasing asset utilization. If you're holding Egyptian sovereign bonds, you're exposed to a 15 to 20% revenue cliff that triggers immediate refinancing risk. If you're a consumer, you see 3 to 5% lower costs on Asian imports to Europe once the corridor scales. Right? But you also see 40% or more cost spikes if regional conflict closes both routes simultaneously. The bypass creates a new choke point. Instead of one vulnerable route, Suez, global trade now depends on two: Suez and the Israel-Saudi corridor. This reduces Egypt's monopoly leverage but increases systemic risk. If Iran-backed forces target both corridors simultaneously, Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping, plus Hezbollah attacks on Israeli infrastructure. Europe faces energy crisis and supply chain paralysis worse than single choke point failure. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. The corridor's critical vulnerability is political sustainability of normalization. If Saudi domestic opposition forces reversal or regional war disrupts the route before the 10 to 12-year break-even point, $20 billion becomes a stranded asset with zero alternative use. Unlike Suez, which has 155 years of operational history, the corridor has no resilience track record. One sustained conflict could collapse utilization before infrastructure costs are recovered. You might be thinking, Egypt will just expand Suez capacity or cut tolls to stay competitive. They have 155 years of operational expertise. Here's the problem with that assumption. Egypt already tried capacity expansion. The new Suez Canal in 2015 cost $8 billion and doubled capacity to 97 ships daily. It didn't increase revenue because demand wasn't the bottleneck. Time and risk were. They're already running near theoretical maximum efficiency. And toll cuts. Egypt is in an IMF austerity program with $42 billion annual debt service. Every 10% toll reduction costs $1 billion in revenue they cannot afford to lose. They have no competitive response that doesn't accelerate their fiscal crisis. The bypass is locked in. Construction is 30% complete, volume commitments are signed, and energy flows redirect in 24 months. Now we reach lever 4, the extraction phase, where Egypt discovers exactly how much a revenue monopoly is worth when it's no longer a monopoly. This is lever 4, the revenue extraction. Here's why this matters to you. When a government loses 15 to 20% of foreign currency earnings in 18 months, the currency collapses, inflation spikes to 40 to 50%, and basic goods become unaffordable, which triggers migration waves toward Europe that reshape labor markets and social policy across the Mediterranean. Egypt's Suez Canal generates $10 billion annually, representing 30% of foreign currency reserves. The Israel-Saudi corridor is designed to capture $3 to $5 billion of that revenue by 2030. That's not competition. That's asset stripping. Britain's sterling area liquidation from 1945 to 1976 followed the same revenue displacement pattern. India, Egypt, and colonial holdings held £3.5 billion in sterling balances, forced savings from wartime trade. When Britain could no longer defend the currency's value, those balances lost 60% of purchasing power through devaluations in 1949 and 1967. Egypt's Suez revenue is denominated in hard currency today, but loses value through traffic diversion. Same mechanism, different asset class. Here's the boardroom math. Egypt's external debt is $165 billion with $42 billion in annual debt service. They need $10 billion from Suez just to keep refinancing cycles stable. Lose 15% of Suez volume, and suddenly they're $1.5 billion short on hard currency, with IMF covenant restrictions preventing competitive toll subsidies or new debt issuance for capacity expansion. The Suez Canal Authority operates with 90% or more profit margins. Minimal variable costs, dredging, pilotage, maintenance are fixed regardless of traffic volume. But those margins assume stable volume. Lose 3,000 ships annually, and the fixed cost base doesn't shrink. Profit collapses from $9 billion to $7 billion almost overnight. The extraction mechanism works through volume bleeding rather than dramatic collapse. Year 1, 2027 to 2028. Pipeline operational, capturing 800 to 1,000 oil and LNG tankers. Suez loses $600 to $800 million. Egypt responds by offering volume discounts to retain traffic, which reduces per-ship revenue, offsetting any volume retention. Year 2, 2028 to 2029. Rail corridor operational, containerized freight begins diverting. Another 1,500 to 2,000 ships shift. Suez loses cumulative $1.5 to $2 billion annually. Egypt's debt service becomes unsustainable. IMF demands austerity, cut fuel subsidies, politically toxic, reduce public sector wages. Unemployment spikes, devalue currency, inflation surges. Each response accelerates capital flight. Here's the second-order extraction. As Suez revenue declines, Egypt's creditworthiness deteriorates. Sovereign bond yields spike from 8% to 12 to 15%. Refinancing $165 billion in debt becomes $7 to $10 billion more expensive annually. The Suez revenue loss compounds through debt servicing costs. It's not just $2 billion in lost tolls. It's $2 billion in lost revenue plus $3 to $4 billion in higher interest expenses plus currency devaluation, destroying purchasing power of remaining reserves. Here's what this means for you. Egyptian pound devaluation, 50% since 2022, likely another 30 to 40% by 2027, makes imports unaffordable. Bread prices double. Unemployment hits 15 to 20% as construction and port sectors contract. This triggers migration. 2 to 3 million Egyptians seeking work in Europe over 36 months, straining EU asylum systems and labor markets. If you're in Southern Europe, you're seeing direct impact on housing costs, public services, and political stability as anti-immigration parties gain leverage. The revenue extraction creates leverage for external actors. China offers bridge financing to cover Suez shortfalls, but with covenants requiring port concessions, 99-year leases, like Sri Lanka's Hambantota. IMF offers bailout tranches, but with governance covenants requiring subsidy cuts and state asset privatizations. Egypt enters a forced choice: accept Chinese infrastructure debt or IMF austerity, both leading to sovereignty erosion. Meanwhile, Israel-Saudi corridor profits compound. As Suez traffic drops, congestion eases for remaining ships, reducing their diversion urgency, until the next regional crisis reminds everyone that single choke point risk is still unacceptable. Then another wave diverts permanently. You might be thinking, Egypt will negotiate a regional agreement to share traffic or stabilize tolls. All parties benefit from avoiding a fiscal collapse that destabilizes North Africa. Here's the problem with that assumption. Israel and Saudi Arabia have zero incentive to bail out Egypt's fiscal model. They just invested $20 billion in infrastructure explicitly designed to capture that revenue. Offering Egypt a partnership means subsidizing a competitor while recovering their own sunk costs. The boardroom logic is brutal. Egypt's pain is their proof of concept. Every ship that diverts validates the $20 billion investment thesis. The extraction is locked in. But construction timelines guarantee traffic diversion by 2028, and Egypt's debt service timeline guarantees crisis within 18 months of volume loss. Now we reach lever 5, the final mechanism, why this displacement becomes permanent. This is lever 5, the permanence lock. Here's why this matters to you. Global supply chains optimize for resilience over cost after COVID-19 exposed single point of failure risk. Once 12 to 15% of traffic establishes the Israel-Saudi corridor as a viable alternative, shipping lines will never return to single choke point dependency, even if Suez drops tolls to zero, because diversification is now more valuable than marginal cost savings. The corridor doesn't need to be cheaper or faster forever. It just needs to exist. The Panama Canal never recovered its pre-1914 dominance after U.S. transcontinental rail integration. Even when canal capacity expanded, the traffic patterns locked in around the faster routes. Infrastructure creates its own demand gravity. Once logistics networks optimize around a new route, reversal requires catastrophic failure of the alternative. Here's the final boardroom lock. Infrastructure sunk costs create irreversibility. Israel and Saudi Arabia are deploying $20 billion in rail, pipeline, and port upgrades with 40-year payback horizons. That capital is unrecoverable. If the corridor fails, the assets have zero alternative use. You can't move a Red Sea Mediterranean rail line. This creates a survival incentive. They must capture and retain traffic to justify the investment. So they'll undercut Suez tolls for the first 5 to 10 years, operating at a loss if necessary, to establish volume commitments. Once shippers sign 10 to 15-year slot contracts, the traffic never reverses, even if Suez becomes cheaper later, because contract penalties and logistics network optimization make switching costs prohibitive. The permanence lock works through three mechanisms. First, contract lock-in, Maersk, MSC, and CMA-CGM, controlling 50% or more of global container capacity. Sign dedicated slot agreements for corridor capacity. These are 10 to 15-year commitments with early termination penalties. Once signed, the shipping line's logistics network optimizes around the new route, vessel schedules, port calls, cargo distribution. Reverting to Suez means re-optimizing the entire network at $50 to $100 million in transition costs. Second, secondary infrastructure investment. Once the corridor is operational, port cities, Haifa, Ashdod, Mediterranean Cyprus, and Greece terminals invest billions in warehouse, transshipment, and logistics capacity to capture the traffic. This creates regional employment and tax revenue, meaning local governments become stakeholders in corridor success. Third, insurance and certification. War risk insurance premiums for Red Sea transit will remain elevated indefinitely. Houthi capabilities persist regardless of corridor existence. But once the corridor establishes a 5-year operational track record, insurance costs for Suez versus corridor equalize, removing the risk premium that previously favored Suez. Here's what this means for you. You benefit from supply chain diversification, less vulnerability to single choke point closure, but pay for it through slightly higher base costs while both routes compete for market share. Long term, you see 3 to 5% lower shipping costs as competition forces efficiency. But you're also exposed to concentration risk. 2 choke points controlled by unstable regions means higher volatility in energy and goods prices whenever conflict flares. The permanence lock creates a new geopolitical reality. Egypt's Suez Canal becomes a secondary route, maintained for backup capacity, but never again the primary Asia-Europe artery. Egypt's foreign policy leverage, historically derived from Suez's monopoly, collapses. They become a peripheral actor in Middle East negotiations, unable to threaten canal closure as geopolitical leverage because traffic has alternatives. You might be thinking, this assumes Israel-Saudi normalization holds for 40 or more years, but one regional war collapses the corridor and sends traffic back to Suez. Here's the problem with that assumption. Infrastructure doesn't disappear during conflict. It gets repaired. After World War II, European rail networks were rebuilt within 5 years because the economic incentive was overwhelming. The Israel-Saudi corridor will have the same resilience. Even if war disrupts operations for 12 to 24 months, the $20 billion sunk cost ensures rapid reconstruction. And during that disruption, Suez doesn't win back market share. Shippers just route around Africa temporarily, then return to the corridor once operational. On Egypt's window to recapture monopoly closed the moment construction began. Those are the 5 levers. Here's why Egypt can't break them, and why you're already paying for the displacement even if you've never heard of the project. Those are the 5 levers that permanently redirect global trade away from the Suez Canal. We've revealed the legacy monopoly that made Egypt's $10 billion revenue stream possible, the normalization covenant that unlocked $20 billion in competitive infrastructure, the capacity bypass that makes Suez geographically optional, the revenue extraction that triggers Egypt's fiscal collapse, and the permanence lock that ensures traffic never returns. The corridor becomes operational in 36 months. Egypt's debt payments come due in 18 months. The question isn't whether the traffic diverts. It's whether anyone notices the global supply chain restructuring before your gas prices shift and Egyptian migration reshapes Mediterranean Europe. The deal is already priced in. You're just waiting for settlement.